Hello and welcome to another episode of Curator with the Camera. I'm Thomas Bain and this week we're doing something different. We're having a wagon bonanza. Normally on Curator with a Camera we look at one vehicle per episode, but this time we're looking at 4 vehicles in one episode, and we're specifically looking at coal wagons. Coal wagons are sort of the unsung heroes of the railway world, and in many respects the reason why railways were built. Millions of tons of coal were taken from pit to port or pit to power station, and a vast infrastructure was developed to actually accommodate the coal wagon. So what we're going to do this episode is waltz through 200 years of railway history by looking at 4 coal wagons. So it's an exciting and fulfilling episode. So for our first coal wagon of the day, we've been on a bit of a wander down to Kilburn's warehouse, which is part of the locomotion site here at Childon. And we're having a look at this, the Seaham Harbour Railway Chaldron wagon, which is from sort of the late 19th century, but the actual design of the chaldron goes back a long, long way. Chaldrons are essentially named after a measure of coal, which is roughly 5,300 weight or 2.5 tons of coal. So the original sort of chaldrons were horse-drawn and were used on some of the early wagonways. And the wooden wagonways tended to link collieries with sort of wharves on the riverside. So the chaldron is essentially the forerunner of a few wagons we're going to see today. It is essentially the forerunner of the hopper wagon. And a hopper is essentially a sort of a container that discharges its payload from the bottom through doors in the bottom. Where you can see there's this gap. Currently a gap there at the moment. So essentially you could run this over a coal chute, and you open the bottom doors and the coal would discharge down the chute and then into the hold of the collier ship. These were locally known as black wagons because of their sort of black sort of colour scheme, presumably wood treatment, just to give the wood a bit of protection from the weather. You can see here dumb buffers. So what I mean by dumb buffers is that they're not sprung. They're essentially blocks of wood, and they just bash into the next set of dumb buffers. There is a handbrake, as you can see on the side of the chaldron wagon, sort of manual handbrake which clamps onto the wheels there. Originally chaldron wagon wheels were made of wood, but then as you had started to have iron rails, you started replacing the wooden wheels with cast iron wheels. These actually had a long life, well over 200 years of use on some form of railway system, whether wagonway and iron railway as well. It kind of shows you the longevity of the design and the fact that they were still using them in the 1970s. It is quite an amazing survivor. So from the oldest one in this Tour de Coal wagon, we'll move on to wagon number 2 in the main building. So now we move on to the chaldron wagon's bigger cousin. This is a North Eastern Railway 20-ton diagram P7 hopper wagon. You can kind of see the actual scale of this thing is a lot bigger. Essentially you can get 5 chaldron wagons worth of coal in this one wagon, so you are achieving economies of scale. So going back to the previous chaldron wagon, change didn't happen overnight, and they were still running around the North Eastern Railway network until 1914 when a ban was put on them. But they could be intermingled while shunting with these larger hopper wagons, and this is evidenced by these sort of buffing plates that you can see here, which allowed the dumb buffers of the smaller chaldron wagons to hit when you're slowing the train down. So again, it discharges from underneath. You can see the hopper doors, there's 8 of them, and here's one of the release mechanisms for the doors. Here's the handbrake mechanism and linkages down to the V-iron, which supports the actual mechanism. Then here's the leaf spring suspension, which is attached to the axle box here. The N and the D markings denote that this particular wagon was used in the northern division of the North Eastern Railway, which was anywhere north of a line between Shildon and Billingham. The North Eastern Railway was very unusual as a railway company because it owned its own coal wagons for general use by its customers, and it kind of monopolised the entire coal transport by rail in the North East for quite a long time. Owning your own wagons had benefits in terms of how the wagon was used. So there's a lot less empty running because the point of demand might be closer than if you had an empty wagon that you had to take all the way back to the owner. So that is wagon number 2 done. Let us move on to wagon number 3. So here we are at wagon number 3, which is a 12-ton mineral wagon owned by the Stanton Iron Company of Derbyshire. And this is very typical of a private owner wagon. Many railway companies did not actually supply coal wagons for general use by traders, and so they sort of buy their own wagons to actually transport their coal. Mineral wagons like this had multiple ways of unloading, and it always depended upon the facilities at the customer's premises. So here we can kind of just about see, this is the latch here for the end tipping door, and what would happen is that one end of the wagon would be raised on the track. The track would be tipped forward, and then the load would actually fall out the front of the wagon here. Other ways of doing it was this small flap here, which you can see the lock, the flap would drop down. You have a bang plate there which sort of hits this piece here, and you can shovel coal out through this door. And then the other way of unloading the wagon, so it's quite a multi-purpose, quite a flexible vehicle, was through doors sort of in the floor of the wagon that you can see here, and you can kind of see the remains of the hinges of the doors sort of in situ here. How people knew where the wagons were going was through these spring clips that you can see here. You'd have a way bill in there which would be filled out before the wagon was dispatched, and essentially at the marshalling yard you had several ways of marshalling trains. You either actually shunted them with a steam locomotive or later a mechanical shunter, or you actually used gravity to shunt these wagons. And when you're working with the force of gravity, you have to slow it down at some point. So this is where the manual brake comes in. You have a brakesman or a wagon chaser who at a critical moment runs after the wagon and has a brake stick, which is a rounded pole with a rectangular end on it that he'd use to push down on the brake lever here while the wagon's in motion to slow it down. It is a very labour-intensive and dangerous piece of work. So that's the Stanton wagon, and now we're going to move on to wagon number 4. So all the previous coal wagons we've had a look at today are essentially all about the wagon load principle. Thousands of individual wagons being processed throughout the railway system and being sent on to their often individual destinations. By the 1960s this was untenable, and the railways were sort of losing money and were trying to find ways of innovating to actually increase the efficiency and therefore reduce the cost. And so they came up with the principle of the merry-go-round, which is essentially a train carrying coal from pit to power station on a continuous basis. And this is actually the prototype merry-go-round hopper wagon, which was actually built at Darlington. but 10,000 of these were built at Childon here at Childon Works. They're equipped with air brakes, but they're also equipped with the hand brake again for when there's no locomotive to provide the air pressure for the brake. You can see the brake hose under there. You can see the cords there which adjust the brake pressure. You've also got roller bearings as well, which is an advance on the oil or even grease-based axle boxes, which earlier coal wagon designs tended to have. You've also got a leaf spring there for the suspension. And these switches that you can see here, these are kind of locks and linkages which disengage the safety catches for the hopper doors. What happened was you had a line-side device, colloquially called a Dalek, which actually engaged with these levers, pulling it down, unlocking the safety catch, and then also mechanically opening the doors as well. So each chute would discharge the load gradually as the train moved through the unloading bay at the power station. Once the load had been discharged, the mechanism was reset and all the doors were closed automatically again, and the whole train then could go straight back to the pit and for the process to start all over again. So it capitalised on what the railways did really well, which is carrying heavy loads with regularity, but it also meant that the assets that the railways owned could be used more intensively. Even though coal plays less of a role in power generation in Britain and has actually been on the in the decline on the railways for quite a number of years now, the basic principle is still used at Drax Power Station, where biomass is unloaded in a similar way. So the merry-go-round system still exists today. So if you enjoyed this wagon bonanza of an episode of Curator with a Camera, please subscribe and leave a like. And thank you for watching.